Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Royal Institute of Philosophy annual debate for 2022. This debate is part of the Being Human Festival, the UK's annual festival of the humanities, still running for another 3 days. If you want to find out more, the hashtag is #BeingHuman2022. Now, I've been instructed to say that if a fire alarm goes off, it's the real thing. No fire drills are planned. And so without more ado, I'd like to hand over to our real host for this evening, who's hosted many more of these events than I have. We're very delighted to have her with us again this evening, Ritula Shah.
Thank you so much, Edward. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this year's debate from the Royal Institute of Philosophy, the first one actually in person since the pandemic, and it is wonderful for us all to be here together in one room, and especially as every year we have these discussions, and we're always sort of dancing on the boundaries of understanding, and this year is no exception, I have to say. We are going to dance on the edge of our understanding of consciousness, to ask if consciousness can be explained. It's likely there have been questions about the nature of consciousness since there were human beings. But as scientific understanding leaps forward, is it time for philosophers to give way to neurologists, to biologists, to all kinds of ists? Basically, get out the way. There's 3 of you sitting here. I wonder if you will. Should philosophy vacate the space and let science take over? It is a fascinating question, I'm sure you'll agree. On the panel, and I'll do longer introductions in a moment, at the far end, Anil Seth, Maja Spener, Philip Goff, and Louise Antony. I'll just briefly explain how the evening's going to work. We're going to hear from each of our panellists in turn. After that, we'll have a short conversation here on the stage, and then we'll open it up to all of you for questions. There are fixed microphones, or there's a fixed microphone I can see over there. So when we get to questions, if you want to ask a question, please come over to that. If for any reason you aren't able, put your hand up. I will make sure that a roving mic gets to you. But that's a bit later on. So without further ado, though, let's get things underway. Our first speaker tonight is Anil Seth. Anil is Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex. He's also co-director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Programme on Brain, Mind and Consciousness. He's also the editor-in-chief of the journal Neuroscience of Consciousness. His 2017 TED Talk has been viewed more than 13 million times, and his 2021 book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, was an instant Sunday Times bestseller. Anil, over to you.
Thank you, Ritula. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. It's a great honour to open this debate. So I'm going to talk for 8 minutes and 8 minutes only about the problem of consciousness. So the nature of consciousness is truly one of the great mysteries in all of science and philosophy. For each of us, consciousness is all there is. Without it, there's no world, there's no self, there's no interior and no exterior. There's simply nothing at all. How does experience happen? How can the redness of red or the sharp pang of jealousy be accounted for by the complex mess of electrified pate inside each of our skulls? Now, there's a strong intuition that it can't be done. On the face of it, consciousness just doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that will ever be amenable to explanation in materialist physical terms. The philosopher David Chalmers put it like this when he was describing his famous hard problem of consciousness. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. The intuition that Chalmers is driving at is that even when we've solved all the easy problems of neuroscience, the problems that the neurologists, the neuroscientists, all the ists might work on, of how the brain functions as a complex biological meat machine, we'd still be totally in the dark about how and why any of this should give rise to or be identical to conscious experience. The hard problem would remain untouched and pristine. Fortunately, there's a middle way, a recipe for increasing our understanding of consciousness, which is in practice what a lot of my fellow neuroscientists do. Rather than setting out to solve the hard problem directly, perhaps by finding the special source that magics experience out of mere mechanism, the science of consciousness is going to be most productive by dissolving it. Now, we can call this the real problem of consciousness. How can mechanisms and processes in the brain and the body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness? The idea is to build increasingly sturdy, load-bearing explanations between properties of biological neural mechanisms and properties of consciousness. And by properties, I largely mean experiential, phenomenological properties. Why a particular experience is the way it is and not some other way. Why the experience of redness is the way it is not like blueness or jealousy or a toothache. And the ambition of this approach is that as we build ever sturdier bridges from the physical to the experiential, the hard problem intuition that consciousness can never be understood in materialist terms will fade away, eventually to disappear in a puff of metaphysical smoke. Now, something like this has happened before. It wasn't that long ago that physicists and chemists thought that life couldn't be explained without reaching for some supernatural, immaterial ingredient, a spark of life, an élan vital. There was a hard problem of life then, just as there seems to be a hard problem of consciousness now. But rather than looking for a spark of life or arguing that life is everywhere or that life doesn't exist, biologists got on with the job of explaining the properties of living systems, metabolism, reproduction, homeostasis, and the hard problem of life dissolved away. But life is not the same as consciousness, of course. A particular problem for consciousness, I'm sure we'll talk about it, is that its main target for explanation, experience itself, cannot be publicly observed. You can put a frog on a table and look at it and study life, but you can't put a conscious experience on a table and look at it. And while this does make the challenge harder, I do not think it makes it impossible. So let me illustrate the real problem approach by distinguishing three broad properties of consciousness: level, how conscious you are; content, what you're conscious of; and self, the experience of being you or being me. First up is level. I'm just going to give you a few tasters of what neuroscientists are doing in these areas at the moment. So what happens in the brain that explains the change in conscious level, such as the transition from wakeful awareness to dreamless sleep? And here, pioneering work by Marcello Massimini and his team have found a measure, a quantitative measure called the Perturbation Complexity Index, which tracks conscious level among many different conditions. It's the first glimpse of a consciousness meter, and we all know how important the ability to measure things has been in the history of science. And what's crucial here is that the measure, this Perturbation Complexity Index, is based on a theory informed by what conscious experiences are actually like. In brief, the measure tracks the neural footprints of the property that conscious experiences are both integrated into unified scenes, we have one experience at a time, and carry a lot of information. So in this way, the brain dynamics, the measure, it doesn't explain something about consciousness. It doesn't merely correlate with it. Next is conscious content, the things out there in the world that we are conscious of when we are conscious. And the big idea here is that what we consciously perceive is not a direct readout of the outside world. Instead, perceptual experience is conveyed by top-down, inside-out predictions about what's out there in the world or in here in the body. We live, in this view, in a controlled hallucination in which the brain's best guesses about the world are calibrated by the sensory signals that it encounters. We don't passively perceive our worlds, we actively generate them. And this concept of the brain as a prediction machine has many things to say about consciousness, such as why objects have a three-dimensional character and why faces always seem to point outwards, even when they are hollow masks, and why vision in general has a kind of spatial nature. There's also plenty of brain evidence, I won't go through the details, that links conscious perception to these top-down, inside-out signaling in the brain, as in this work by my colleague Biyu He and NYU. Finally, there's conscious self. This is the idea the self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is a perception too, another kind of controlled hallucination. Now, different aspects of self-experience can be understood as different forms of perceptual prediction, whether it's the experience of the object in the world that is your body, or of the body from the inside. And here, the distinctive character of emotional experiences can be understood in terms of perceptual predictions that aren't trying to figure out what's out there, but are trying to regulate, control the inside of the body to keep us alive. And this line of thinking has led me to recognize that our status as conscious creatures is intimately related to our nature as living organisms. These ideas are more than just correlations between things happening in consciousness and things happening in the brain. They're all based on theories which give explanatory insight and predictive power. Here are some theories of consciousness. They're all grounded in neuroscience, and they all attempt to explain different aspects of consciousness in different ways, and they all derive from different philosophical traditions too. And experiments now are trying to distinguish between these theories to close some doors while we still open others. And I'll close here too. I don't claim that materialist physical explanations will inevitably solve or even dissolve the hard problem of consciousness. I think it's likely, but I don't know that it's true. Perhaps some residue of mystery will remain. But what I do claim is that following this real problem strategy of doing the hard work of developing and testing theories grounded in physical mechanisms about the properties of consciousness will yield significant progress. And this will be reflected as much in the questions we ask as in the answers we find. And philosophy, of course, does remain central to this project, but perhaps not the kind of philosophy that claims to solve the problems of consciousness by fiat, but instead the kind that keeps us thinking clearly, and as in the phenomenological tradition, tells us more about what it is we're trying to explain when we're trying to explain consciousness. Now, understanding consciousness is not easy, but just because something seems mysterious now, with the tools and the concepts that we have now, doesn't mean it will always seem mysterious. So let's not underestimate the resources of materialism. A philosophically informed materialism gives us our best chance of ratcheting up our understanding so that we will see more clearly what can, and what, if anything, cannot be woven into the rich tapestry of nature. I'll give my last words to the poet Emily Dickinson. The brain is wider than the sky, for, put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside.
Anil, thank you so much. Plenty to chew on there. Our next speaker is Maja Spener. Maja is an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Birmingham. Her research lies primarily in the philosophy of psychology and mind and in the history of empirical psychology, with a special focus on introspection, scientific methodology, and natural kinds. Maja, over to you.
Thank you. So, I've always thought of philosophers as raisers of problems rather than solvers of problems. So I'm going to try to say how philosophers earn their keep by raising a problem for precisely the kind of project that Anil was just outlining. So I want to look at how researchers in the science of consciousness gather data about consciousness, which they have to do like any good scientist has to do when they investigate their phenomena. But it's tricky because we don't have third-person direct access to consciousness. We don't have yet the consciousness meter that David Chalmers talks about. We can't point an instrument at somebody's head and tell what states they're in, what conscious states they're in, or whether they're conscious at all. But most people, do agree that we have first-person direct access to our own conscious situation. We have introspective access to consciousness. So if I ask you, do you have a headache now? You can tell me that. Or are you seeing something green? You can tell me that. You can't tell it about your neighbor, and they can't tell about you. You can introspect your own conscious situation only. As a result, the field, the science of consciousness, has two broad types of measure available. There are objective measures that use third-person behavioral data or neural markers that are taken to be indexed to consciousness. And then there are subjective measures where the collection of data involves collecting subjective reports of individuals telling you about their experience or indicating it in some way. Both of these types depend on introspective access. Most straightforwardly, the subjective reports are taken to be produced by the individual introspecting, but also to validate to the indexing relationship, you'd have to appeal to subjective reports at some point, and thus to introspection. And here now comes the problem that is recognized in the field. It's a methodological problem. Firstly, introspection does seem to be our primary, perhaps our only, direct source of information about consciousness. And secondly, we just said, introspection is private. You can only do it for yourself. So in collecting the reports, the scientist has to trust the individuals delivering the reports. They have to trust that they introspect correctly. But, thirdly, the thought is the grounds for the trust is missing in that there are many reasons to think that introspection is unreliable. For example, I can easily incentivize subjects to deliver positive reports that they saw something by offering money for it. And I can get them to be much more conservative by threatening punishment if you tell me that you saw something when it wasn't there. So introspection, there are many more reasons. Introspection is thought to be unreliable, and if that's so, here's the problem or the challenge. Introspection seems both indispensable and unreliable for doing the science of consciousness, and that's not exactly great news for it being scientific. There are two polarized reactions to this methodological problem in the field. One side I'm calling the global pessimists, and they say, look, introspection is unreliable. We really, really shouldn't use it. We must give up on its use on subjective reports in doing the science. And if indeed it is indispensable, then so much the worse for the field itself. The science of consciousness is doomed. On the other side are what I'm calling the faith-based optimists, who say it's okay. We can still use introspection. We can do the science of consciousness. We've made these many technological, empirical, and mathematical advances which have improved more generally the reliability of subjective measures or measures in the science of consciousness. So I think that both of these reactions are misguided. One, the global pessimists overestimate the problem, and the faith-based optimists, they underestimate it greatly. The reason is that there's nothing really said about three. It's either accepted and then there's a wholesale rejection, or it's just said, look, it's fine, we'll get by. But as a result, because nothing much in detail is said about introspection being unreliable, to what extent, what are the limitations exactly, global pessimists and faith-based optimists leave the methodological problem really untreated. That is because I think there's a gap in contemporary science of consciousness, because introspection itself is seriously under-theorized. And the result is that there's this imprecision at the heart of subjective measures in particular, where they seem to face a ragbag of reliability problems that seem overwhelming. And at the same time, there are no real resources to respond in any detail to say, no, we can do this, but not this. And the result is that this sort of situation really renders the field unstable, I think, because now people say it's not even a science. Yes, it is, but nothing is said to exactly give you the limitations and the potential in any fine-grained way. And so the methodological problem in that sense becomes a foundational problem. I don't think it has to be that way. And what I offer is a framework for theorizing, for treating the methodological problem by supplying what's missing, I think, which is a theoretical, detailed conception of introspection or introspective access. And the first thing we need to do is distinguish between different modes, in particular, at least 3 modes of introspective access, of a way in which you're self-aware. There's an attentional form. There is a memory-based form. You can retrospect. And there is a kind of reflexive way of being aware peripherally of your experiences as you go along. These are very different modes of introspective access. And once we distinguish them properly, we can connect them to a lot of empirical and philosophical work on, say, attention or episodic memory, and get a more detailed, empirically informed understanding of these three modes, which in turn allows us to really articulate some level of specification, the methodological strength and weaknesses of each mode. And then we can, I say, in the science of consciousness, go ahead and really choose the right mode of introspective access in relation to a specific target of investigation, a specific aspect of consciousness. So, in conclusion, I think that there are a cluster of reliability problems connected with the scientific uses of different modes of introspective access. But once we really think about introspection properly, these problems are local, they're not global. So they're specific to uses on an occasion of a given mode of introspective access in service of a particular goal of inquiry. And they're independent, so they don't bleed across. So a problem for one employment of a given mode doesn't, in service of a particular goal of investigation, doesn't automatically constitute a problem for a different mode investigating something different. And that makes these problems amenable to be managed experimentally. And as a result, we get a better conception about the limits and the potential. I do think that that means that the optimists here, the ones who want to use introspection, have to bake, in German we say bake smaller bread. They have to be a little bit more modest. But the good news is there's no single methodological problem about the use of introspection that threatens the foundations of the science. Thank you.
Maja, thank you very much. Let's hear next from Philip Goff. Philip is an associate professor of philosophy at Durham University. His main research focus is consciousness, but he's interested in many questions about the nature of reality. He's written an academic book with the OUP, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, and a book aimed at a general audience, Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. He's currently working on a book exploring the middle ground between God and atheism, which will be published next year.
Okay, so the mystery of consciousness continues to be one of the most puzzling intellectual challenges of our time. Despite great progress in our scientific understanding of the brain, we still don't really have an explanation as to how electrochemical signaling could somehow produce the inner world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us enjoys every second of waking life. So why do we still struggle here? Well, partly because there are just very deep challenges, but I also think we make the problem a little bit harder for ourselves because we miscategorize it, or it's quite commonly miscategorized, in my view. So the standard way of setting things up is in terms of the so-called hard problem of consciousness, defined as the challenge of explaining how brains produce consciousness. And this is often not as much as it used to be. It used to be every kind of New Scientist or Scientific American article on consciousness did this. Not as much as it used to be, but still often portrayed as a purely scientific problem. You know, we just need to plug away at our standard methods of investigating the brain and we'll crack it and get a Nobel Prize or something. But I'm inclined to think, I would argue that what we're dealing here at root is a philosophical rather than a purely scientific challenge. What we have is what has traditionally been known as not the hard problem of consciousness, but the mind-body problem. And I think the mind-body problem arises because we have access to objective reality in two very different ways: perception and introspection. So through perception, we get access to the physical world around us via our senses, and we've learned to do that more accurately and precisely through science. And through introspection, we have access to consciousness via our immediate awareness of our own feelings and experiences. And then the mind-body problem arises as the challenge of how to bring these two seemingly different things, consciousness and the physical world, together in a single unified theory of reality. So I think at root this is a philosophical challenge, and broadly speaking, there are three philosophical proposed solutions. Number one, materialism, the view Anil is sympathetic to, that it's the physical world that is fundamental, and consciousness arises from physical processes in the brain. Secondly, the view I prefer, panpsychism, which turns this on its head, which says, actually, no, it's consciousness that's fundamental, and the physical world arises from more fundamental facts about consciousness. Thirdly, dualism, that both consciousness and the physical world are equally fundamental but distinct. And contemporary proponents of this, like David Chalmers or Martina Niederrümelin, tend to postulate special laws of nature called psychophysical laws to connect up consciousness and the physical world. Crucially, all these three options are, at least in certain forms, empirically equivalent. So you're not going to distinguish between them with an experiment. So let me just try and press that with a couple of slides. Now, experiments are very important, obviously, when trying to understand consciousness. But I think in relation to the mind-body problem, the primary role of experiments is to help us understand which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of conscious experience. So although you can't access consciousness through perception, you can't see someone's feelings, you can access their brains, you can scan their brains, and you can ask them what they're feeling, or you can look for external markers of consciousness, and you can try and work out which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of experience, and more generally, which kinds of brain activity in general go along with consciousness in general. And this is, I guess, what's been discussed in the last two presentations. To take one example that Anil defends that he talked about in his presentation, this comedy duo tonight. This cool idea that perhaps consciousness is correlated with predictive processing in the brain, a very interesting, attractive proposal. Just taking this as a randomly chosen example, but crucially, this hypothesis is just neutral on all of the philosophical options I just discussed. Right? They would all just accommodate it quite easily in their different ways. So materialists would say that consciousness arises from predictive processing, or maybe is identical to. The panpsychists would say predictive processing arises from underlying facts about consciousness. We could talk more about that maybe later, how we make sense of that. The dualist would argue that the psychophysical laws that hook up consciousness to the physical world connect consciousness to predictive processing in the brain. Predictive processing being the brain's best guesses, as it were, as to what's going on around it. So you're not going to... So let's suppose this hypothesis, Anil is sympathetic to, gets strong empirical support. It's still not going to help us decide between these options at all, one iota, which is not surprising because this is a philosophical question. Similarly, you're not going to get an experiment which in any straightforward way is going to tell you whether the pro-choice position or the pro-life position on the ethics of abortion is correct, because it's not an experimental question, it's a philosophical question. Likewise, when we're dealing with the mind-body problem, experiments can often be relevant, but at core, this is not in itself an experimental question, which is why I think the life thing is a red herring, because I think that was a purely scientific question about explaining observable data, but the mind-body problem, I think, is clearly not a purely experimental question. So when we deal with this confront the mind-body problem as a philosophical problem, which is the correct answer? Well, obviously in 1 minute I can't fully defend my view, but for what it's worth, my own view is that materialism is not very plausible at all. We haven't made any progress on its central explanatory task of explaining how we could get consciousness out of purely physical processes. Anil's saying, he's offering us explanations. I would say he's offering us very cool, very interesting potential explanations, but to get a full explanation, you'd have to plug it in. You'd have to marry it with one of these three proposals. I'm not sure why you'd favour the proposal that no one's ever managed to make sense of. Also, I think it's a big debate, but I think there are good arguments, like the knowledge argument, that show that the materialism about consciousness is just not a coherent position. Just as Galileo proved that Aristotle's view about all heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, Galileo proved is incoherent. I think we can prove that materialism is incoherent, although obviously it's a huge debate. In terms of panpsychism, I think we've already worked out how to do this. The problem is essentially solved. And here I think Bertrand Russell should be seen, although is not as generally seen, should be seen as the Darwin of consciousness here. I think in the 1920s, he worked out how we can make sense of the physical world arising from underlying facts about mind and consciousness. The problem is essentially solved. In terms of dualism, I think dualism is a coherent possibility, but as scientists and philosophers, we try to respect Occam's razor. We try to have the most simple, parsimonious theory of reality, and I think this pushes us towards one of the first two options. Why believe in two kinds of thing when you can believe in one? So if I'm right that there's just such an overwhelming case for the panpsychist option here, why isn't it more popular than it is? It's come a lot more respected in recent years, but it's still very much a minority position. Well, there's a huge discussion here, a huge complicated situation, which I wouldn't pretend to simplify, but I think one factor that plays a heavy role here is our scientistic culture, which involves a lack of understanding of what philosophy is and the role it has to play in the project of trying to find out the nature of reality. Important qualification, I'm not saying most philosophers subscribe to scientism. I don't think they do. I don't even think most scientists working on consciousness do. I don't think anyone on this panel does, at least in the most strong form of scientism. But I think it has a very heavy influence in our culture, and it influences how the debate is perceived. So, for example, the objection I most often get online is, what are the predictions of panpsychism? And I mean, that question is just as senseless as what are the predictions of the pro-choice position on abortion ethics? Because this is a philosophical, not an experimental position. The predictions of panpsychism are the same as the predictions of dualism, same as the predictions of materialism. So I think it's our scientific culture that makes it seem like that's a reasonable thing to ask and a reasonable thing to worry about when you can't give an answer to it. So I do have faith, however, that we will at some point move on from this scientific culture. It's what I spend a lot of my time trying to argue for, and that we will, as a society, at some point properly confront the mind-body problem as a philosophical problem. I suspect at that point, panpsychism will just seem pretty straightforwardly the more plausible option, but we'll have to wait and see. And here's a picture of my book, my podcast, my Twitter handle. Thank you very much for listening.
Philip, thank you very much. Gauntlets have definitely been thrown down. We will rush to pick them up a little bit later. Let's hear from the fourth of our very distinguished panellists. Louise Antony is Professor Emerita at the University of Massachusetts and visiting professor at Rutgers University. Her research interests are in the philosophy of mind, feminist theory, and philosophy of religion. She's the editor of Philosophers Without Gods, Meditations on the Secular Life, and co-editor of A Mind of One's Own, Feminist Essays on Reason and Objectivity. She's also recently published a volume of essays, Only Natural, Knowledge, Gender and Humankind. Louise.
Thank you. To address this evening's question, I happen to think that, barring nuclear holocaust or climate collapse, human science can explain consciousness. The question I want to address, however, is which science is the one for the job? Now, many people, including some people on the stage, seem to think that neuroscience is the science that will tell us how the mind works. the science that will unlock the puzzles of consciousness, perhaps dissolve them. Perhaps they have in mind reasoning like the following. Here's a common argument. Minds are made out of brains. Neuroscience is the science of brains. Therefore, neuroscience is the science we should use to study minds. But this is a bad argument. To see why, let's consider the following parallel argument. Brains are made of atoms. Physics is the science of atoms. Therefore, physics is the science we should use to study brains. Now, why is this a bad argument? The conclusion seems obviously wrong. Physics is not the only science that there is. So what has gone wrong? Well, there are two important facts that these two arguments ignore. The first fact is that reality is layered. It has multiple levels. And the second fact is that the higher level facts cannot be inferred from the lower level facts. So let's start with the first problem, not realizing that reality is layered. Although everything is made of fundamental particles, I'm a materialist. Combinations of particles give rise to objects, properties, and regularities that are only visible at higher levels of reality. So take a look at this picture. Anybody know what this is a picture of? Any guesses? Just shout it out. It's a very common object. You've all seen it. It's the seeds of a yellow pepper. I think the seeds of a red pepper probably look exactly the same way. But the point is that you cannot recognize these as seeds of a pepper at this level, at the first level of resolution. You're up too close. You have to pull back. You have to look from a distance. And that's pretty much the way reality is. There are things that you can see about reality if you look very closely, and there are things that you can only see about reality if you, in some sense, move back or move up a level of abstraction. Now, science, like reality, is layered. Each level of reality has a corresponding science that reveals forms, functions, and regularities, laws, at that level. That's why physics is not the only science. Higher level sciences seek explanations in terms of lower level sciences. So it's not that the higher level sciences just describe things at their level of reality and let things go. No. There is unification of science, at least there's an objective of science being unified, in that higher level sciences, once they have documented the properties and regularities, seek explanation of those properties and regularities in terms of lower level sciences. And by the way, philosophy and mathematics can be regarded as the maximally abstract, highest level sciences. So I do want to make a pitch for my discipline. I think we do have an important role to play in understanding many things, including the mind, and mathematics has to also be taken into account, as we'll see. The level of the mind is a higher, more abstract level than the brain, and psychology is the appropriate level of science for, at least initially, studying the mind. To study consciousness, we need first to learn how consciousness functions. Now let's move to the second problem with that bad argument. This is the fact that we cannot infer form or function from the bottom up. Knowing the properties of parts doesn't enable us to infer what organized collections of parts can do. Understanding the parts doesn't necessarily tell us what the parts can make. In some cases, even knowing what the parts do make doesn't help you understand how you get from the parts to the object. But seriously, folks, imagine trying to infer the function of a strand of DNA just from its chemical structure. What I've got here is a diagram of the etiology of a disease called sickle cell anemia. Once it was discovered that the anemia was caused by the distorted geometry, the form, of the victim's red blood cells, and once it was known which parts of the genome coded for red blood cell shape, function, the precise biochemical process from gene to abnormal hemoglobin to distorted cell shape to the disease could be explained. This is why just studying the brain will not, on its own, tell us what consciousness is or how it works. Without the higher level functional analysis, the transition from brain matter to consciousness will seem like magic. Correlations of brain states with conscious states don't add up to explanations. And this seems to me to be the conclusion that you come to if you think there's a hard problem of consciousness, because you're trying to go directly from the neurology to the consciousness. Okay, so how should things be done? What I advocate is top-down explanation, and here's how it works. First step, give a functional analysis of the higher level property. So in the case of consciousness, we want to know, what is the role of consciousness? What does it do? How is it integrated with, for example, perception, memory, reason, and attention? And at the functional level, in psychology, quite a bit is known about these relations. Step 2, use that functional analysis to set design specs for investigation at lower levels. See how the functions are realized in the medium of the lower level. That is, see how lower level structures could perform the higher level functions. Now, this process of top-down explanation is how science has always proceeded. For example, the discovery of the chemical structure of genes was crucially informed by an understanding of what genes do. Now, I want to conclude with a case study, a case where we move from math to psychology to neuroscience, a happy collaboration among math, psychology, and neuroscience to answer an important question about vision. So what are the functional questions we start with? Well, here's a fact about human vision. Human beings can recognize the same form or shape of an object through different translations. So when a dancer moves, her legs might be up and down and touching the ground, but then she leaps and her legs are in a very different orientation. And yet we don't say, oh my God, what is that creature? We recognize it as a human being whose legs have moved. So how does that happen? Another thing that human beings can do visually is identify novel members of a category. So if you look at dogs, they come in literally all shapes and sizes. Very, very young children can recognize if they have one of those black and white family-looking dogs in their house, they still can recognize a dachshund as a dog. They don't make mistakes about that. They don't think that white Pekingese dogs are white Persian cats, for example. They're very, very good at distinguishing cats and dogs. How do they do that? How do they know which things are members of the same group and which things are not? Well, here's what we've learned. Now, I'm going to cite some studies, and I'll have quotations from the studies that I cite, but I'm going to summarize the studies and not read the quotations. We can come back and read those if you want. This is just to prove to you that I actually did look up the studies. Okay, so let's start with a mathematical proposal. The mathematician Harry Blum, in 1973, wrote a paper showing that certain mathematical constructions that he called medial axis representations, they've come to be known as shape skeletons. Blum showed that these representations efficiently encode shape information in a way that preserves shape under variations of orientation and size. Now, you can think of a shape skeleton as an imaginary line drawn through the center of a shape, each point of which is equidistant from the edges of the shape. So it's sort of the center or tendency of the shape. Okay, for the next step, we turn to psychology. The question here is, do human beings actually extract and use shape skeletons? Does the visual system somehow manage to see the shape skeleton from a surface representation that is on the retinal image? And the answer is yes, and there's a lot of data on this. I cite one study from Lowett, Firestone, and Scholl. They found that shape skeletons better predict adult judgments of shape similarity and difference than surface features do. And very interestingly to me, Eisenberg and Lorenko showed that shape skeletons predict infants, very young infants, I think 3 and 4 months, Infants shape recognition of novel objects across variation in component parts, which means this is not learning. This is built in. Our visual system knows from the get-go what it's after. Now, for the final step, we bring in neuroscience. So here the question is, how could shape skeletons be encoded and processed in the neural hardware? Well, Hung, Carlson, and Connor found evidence of neural encoding of shape skeletons in the same neural structures that encode surface features. Notice, one neural structure, two functions. If you're just trying to infer from the bottom up, you might think, well, we've got one neural structure, there must be one thing it does. No, it turns out the same neural structure can do two different things. Hung, Carlson, and Connor used the technique of single-cell recording for their findings. Lesguart and Biederman found evidence of encoding in V3, visual cortex part of the brain, one of the parts of the brain that does visual processing. They found this in humans using fMRI studies. I've argued that our best hope for dispelling the mysteries of consciousness is to start at the top with philosophy, yay, math, and psychology, and work our way down to the science of the brain. That's the way to get rid of the need for magic. Special thanks to E.J. Green, who helped me organize this material, to the Royal Institute of Philosophy for this wonderful debate, and to all of you for listening.
Louise, thank you so much. So this is the point when we try and pick up some of these ideas and discuss them. I will open the floor to all of you. We started a little bit late, so if that's okay, we'll keep on going for a little bit longer so we have enough time for questions from the floor as well. But I do want to begin by asking one or two of my own, and I'm going to be fairly basic, and then we'll see where we go. Anil, first of all, we've had lots of reasons why neuroscience isn't the answer to understanding consciousness. You make it clear that it's not going to be an easy task, but are you overstating how much we actually know already?
Well, I thought it'd be a risk coming to the Royal Institute of Philosophy and debating with three philosophers. I knew I wasn't going to give myself an easy ride. But, I don't think I am. I think most neuroscientists are aware that we don't know very much. I mean, the brain is insanely complex, 86 billion neurons, 1,000 times more connections. What it could be capable of with such a complex mechanism is really, it's unclear. So it's not forgiven that a study of the brain will deliver an understanding of consciousness. And I think Louise makes the point very, very, very well that studying the brain alone is doomed to failure. And I would defend neuroscience a little bit by saying neuroscientists don't do that. I mean, it's always about connecting levels. You always try and bridge different levels. And function is, there's a whole body of work in my area, which is exactly about what are the function of consciousness, comparing conscious and unconscious conditions, boiling it down. I don't think that's enough, actually. I think you really need to bring in the phenomenology too, and explain the experiential properties, not just the functional properties. I think that the main defense of the kind of broadly neuroscientific view that is all about bridging these levels too, is that it's a very productive science. It's a very productive approach. That is, even if it ends up being, in the end, insufficient, you learn a lot on the way, and the questions you ask change. And so here's a little challenge to Philip, who makes a very good point that materialism and dualism and panpsychism are empirically indistinguishable. You can't do an experiment that is going to distinguish these positions. It would be nice, maybe you could, but usually you can't. That is true, but it's irrelevant. What matters is how productive that a particular view is for advancing the knowledge. Sure, everything is compatible, but that doesn't mean that taking one view, you ask the same questions that you would do if you take another view. And you know this, like in panpsychism, you focus on this thing called the combination problem, which is what the problem you think is important to solve if you're a panpsychist. In dualism, you might look for these psychophysical bridging laws. In materialism, we look for the phenomena of consciousness that we can explain in terms of mechanisms. And that's been a very productive thing that people have been doing for decades and has really changed what we understand about not everything about consciousness, but lots of things about consciousness. So I think the promise of a neuroscientific view, and just to bring in a really good point about the main difficulty is how we get the data. Can we really do it, given that there's this intrinsic privacy and subjectivity? And you distinguish sort of faith-based optimism and global pessimism. I like to think that I and a lot of my colleagues are reason-based optimists, that we know the limits of introspection. And you nice distinction between three different types, but there's also things like second-person methods, elicitation interviews, that try to bracket out the biases of somebody asking questions. And we have very good methods in psychophysics for exactly dealing with these biases that you mentioned right at the beginning. If you offer people money, sure, you'll bias them to say yeah, but we can easily measure that bias and separate it from sensitivity. So there are ways to solve the problem. There are ways to address the problem while recognizing it's a problem. So I would say neuroscience can be rationally optimistic, is in a sort of Feyerabend philosophy of science thing. It's a productive rather than a degenerative program. And absolutely, it's all about connecting levels and dealing with emergence and building in a functional perspective. And I think that'll get us a long way to where we need to go.
You've knocked everybody back there, but Maja, I'm going to bring you in first of all. Do you feel reassured that there's this snappily titled Perturbation Complexity Index that Anil talks about? There are these methods for measuring. Does that begin to answer some of your concerns about the methodological approach?
Do I have to talk about that one?
You can try. You can answer what you like.
I'll answer a little bit more directly. So I do think perhaps, I do think that contemporary science of consciousness is more faith-based than it perhaps is aware of. And yes, there are these ways to try and rule out biases of various kinds. But when I look at the experiments themselves and the data collection, it tends to be external constraints. So what happens is that what you try to do is use performance data involving stimulus perception to kind of get a handle on how far off the subject might be. And I know that there are fancy ways of doing sort of meta D calculations and all of these things, but the experiments themselves, they're not very precise about what you're asking the subject to do, right? And so what I see is that I come from a historical perspective, so I look at the old introspectionists, and I think they had it worked out better in many ways. And it would be good to look again at the old psychologists to see how they thought about, say, using attention, introspective attention, rather than retrospection. I don't see much experimental discipline there to keep these apart, for example. But I am not, I'm in favor of the project. I'm an optimist myself, but I think I see too much of a lack of theorizing about introspection itself. But there are details there that would need to be discussed here about even the beginning of the data collection, like when you, in one of your papers with Jakob Howie, for example, there are sort of phenomenological observations, you call them, that are just sort of, you help yourselves to them sometimes about what consciousness is like and the things that you need to explain. And there, I think, again, more attention to how you actually get the phenomenological data would be good.
Philip, from your perspective, is Anil even asking the right questions?
I think he certainly is asking the right questions, and he's doing very well at answering them. It's just that it's nothing to do with philosophy. I don't think there's any connection between the great work and very productive work Anil does and the philosophical position called materialism. I've read Anil's book. I loved it. I didn't have a problem with any of it except where he says, "Oh, and by the way, I'm a materialist." I think if Anil was a dualist or a panpsychist, he'd do all the same things. He would just, when in philosophical mode, interpret it in a different way. Maybe an analogy might be if we imagine a theist scientist and an atheist scientist, maybe cosmologists. They would have different understandings of why the universe exists. Maybe the atheist thinks it's a brute fact. The theist thinks it's created and sustained by God. But that doesn't necessarily affect their science. They get on with the science in the same way. And I think I showed quite precisely how I just took one claim Anil defends, and showed how a dualist, a panpsychist, a materialist could totally embrace that. Just with their philosophical hat on, they'd give a different interpretation of it. But I just really dispute that it impacts the science at all. I mean, David Chalmers is a good example of he's a philosopher rather than a scientist, but he's a very empirically involved scientist. Or Ned Block as a materialist, David Chalmers as a dualist. In terms of their approach to the science, their dualism and their materialism don't make a difference. It's just so just finally, Anil says, well, I'd be answering the combination problem if I was a panpsychist. No, I think there's the philosophical tasks and the scientific tasks. The philosophical task for the panpsychist is the combination problem. For the dualist is maybe the interaction problem. For the materialist is the hard problem. But they're the philosophical problems, and I think when it comes to the scientific problems, it's just neutral on these different philosophical perspectives.
Louise, I'm going to bring you in here because I suspect that you disagree with Philip's position, and yet you would agree that perhaps the way that Anil approaches consciousness is not necessarily what you'd advocate.
So, I do disagree with Philip about the prospects for a materialist explanation of consciousness. I think that if you just correlate physical states with psychological states, you're just going to have correlations. You're not going to have explanations. But I think that if you map the functional reality, then you can ask very focused questions about how this function gets carried out. And you can find material structures that carry it out. And now you have an explanation. Why does attention work the way it does? Well, we know some facts about how attention works. We know that it's independent of, in visual attention, it's independent of focus. You can focus on something and attend to something else. And we have some ideas about how in the neurology of the eye and the neurological processing that goes on once signals leave the back of the retina, how those two things can be dissociated, how focus can come apart from attention. I did want to pick up on Anil's glancing reference to predictive processing, which is something that I'm just learning about, predictive processing views of perception. I think predictive processing, and Anil will correct me as soon as I say something wrong, predictive processing is a bottom-up motivated theory of perception. And it cannot, as far as I can tell, explain some of the well-known functional features of visual perception. Anil had a slide that showed a little peg sitting on a checkerboard. This is a absolutely, literally textbook illustration of a visual phenomenon called lightness constancy. You will see, when you look at if you looked at the slide, you'd see that you would identify a certain pair of squares as one being white and one being dark. In fact, they have exactly the same luminance. They're reflecting exactly the same amount of light. The visual system, however, knows, in some sense, that one of them is in shadow, and it corrects for that. Now, we know this functionally, and lightness constancy is not the only constancy that the visual system takes account of. But we have functional models of these things that have given us very, very clear and detailed guidance about how the visual system actually accomplishes these things. Now, predictive coding, as far as I can tell, is motivated by an understanding of some of the physical processes that go on in the brain. It's known that there is informational feedback from, as it were, higher level structures to lower level structures. However, there are lots of things that predictive coding simply cannot explain, as far as I can tell, that are known at the functional level. So just a little illustration. I've drawn two lines here. Can people see them, roughly? Would you agree? I sound like a magician, don't I? Would you agree? Perfectly ordinary lines, have nothing in my pocket. They're basically the same length. Yes? Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make a slight alteration. How about now? Do they look the same length? No. But you know they're the same length. I didn't change the length of the lines. So your brain, if it's predicting, is saying they're the same length. Your vision is saying, no, they're not. Now, one of the explanations for this is that this configuration of lines occurs in naturalistic settings in situations where, in the one case, there's a joining of planes that is concave with respect to you, and in the other, there's a joining of planes that is convex with respect to you. And the visual system knows that two lines of the same ocular length, where one is farther away than the other, signify two different actual physical lengths. The visual system knows that. Cognition knows that the visual system is getting fooled, that cognition cannot correct vision. Vision won't have it. Vision is informationally encapsulated. It doesn't take instruction from cognition. There's a perception-cognition boundary that the functional evidence demonstrates, I think, very, very clearly. And I don't know how predictive coding deals with it. In fact, I don't know, apart from binocular rivalry, I've not seen any functional level
I think there's a man at the back of the class
I'm sorry,
who might have an answer.
Well, I do disagree with you.
Okay.
I think, well, firstly, predictive processing has many origins, right? This broad framework, there's an origin in signal processing. There's an algorithm for predictive coding that was in compression of signals from engineering.
Sure. Right.
But there's also a background in philosophy, and it's very functional. The idea of what is the problem that brains are trying to solve when they do perception? It's the problem of inferring the causes of sensory signals.
Right.
To figure out what's useful. Not necessarily what's there, but what's useful. So this goes back to Kant, it goes back to Ibn al-Haytham, the Arabian scholar in the 15th century, and of course it really takes off with Hermann von Helmholtz in the late 19th century. And it's totally functional, set up as a problem of, okay, that's the problem. The next level would be, you write it formally as the brain is faced with a kind of Bayesian-like inference problem. How does it solve
Not
that?
that far.
Well, that's one way to describe that problem. Then you can say, how does the brain? Then you come up with a process theory. So just as you were describing in your talk, you come up with what kind of mechanism could achieve these functions, and then you get something like predictive processing, predictive coding.
No, you don't.
Yes, you do.
That's where I disagree.
But no, you actually. You do.
First of all, well, how does predictive processing deal with this is called the Mueller-Lyer.
Yeah, it deals.
How does it deal with it?
Perfectly well. And you can build predictive coding models of Mueller-Lyer, of Adelson's checkerboard, of binocular rivalry, of all these things. Because what's happening here from a predictive coding point of view is the brain has priors about how things generally are, and they can be at different levels. So the light constancy thing, to take Adelson's checkerboard first, there is there's prior knowledge built into the visual system of the brain that objects in shadow appear darker than they are. That is constituted, or so the theory would say, as a top-down prediction about the luminance of the signal that should be expected given the high-level context of an object in shadow. So that gives you the phenomenology of Adelson's checkerboard. The same thing could be said about Mueller-Lyer illusion. By the way, it's totally untrue to say that vision is encapsulated.
It's totally true.
It's totally untrue. I like the way this debate is going. There's plenty of things that there are some things that are. Mueller-Lyer is possibly one of them, but maybe not. But many other things are definitely not.
Okay, we totally have to. We're going to step outside. I just want to make one quick emendation to what Anil said. Yes, computational models of the visual system have been extremely successful and extremely fruitful, but they have not been general models of cognition meddling with perception. That's a separate step. Also, Bayesianism could be the way it could be the computational model that best describes what vision does, but it's been far from demonstrated.
Well, on that massive disagreement, I'm going to open it up to all of you. There is a fixed microphone at the back over there. And if you need a roving microphone, and there's one up there as well, I apologise. If you need a roving microphone, then put your hand up. We'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. Please keep it relatively brief if you can, questions rather than statements. There is, I think, somebody up there. If you could speak into the microphone so everyone can hear you.
One of the big questions is, It's all well and good knowing what's going on inside yourself in your own mind, but what about the minds of other people? And in order to get some kind of evidence or understanding of it, you need to have language. Even for something like introspection, you need language. Even if it's your own introspection, you need to have some method of talking about it, describing it, etc. Right? And so I would suggest maybe that without language, you can't study consciousness. Or another question similar is, what came first, consciousness or language or consciousness, whichever.
Lovely.
That's a
We
question.
shall talk about that. Thank you very much. Do you want to ask your question as well, and then we can open it up to the panel?
Actually, it's a little bit of a follow-up because it's also to do with introspection. And sorry, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a philosopher, so it's going to be very basic. But Maja mentioned that introspection is under-theorized. And my question is, to what extent introspection can be a little bit tricky in order for us to understand consciousness, because, well, introspection is not precise because consciousness is not that precise. So if consciousness is not really, it's not a binary phenomenon, it's not whether we're conscious or not conscious, if it's a spectrum, then, if we are not fully conscious, then whatever we are trying to describe in terms of how conscious we are is going to be not particularly precise. And I know I'm a little bit conflating the concepts here, but to what extent being more mindful can help us to be more conscious, and therefore the introspection of people who practice mindfulness is going to be a better measure of consciousness.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, let's start with those two. Without language, how do we even describe consciousness? And which came first, consciousness or language? Which also brings me to a question that I was interested in raising, which was the extent to which the way in which we think about consciousness is actually cultural. And the second question, which was introspection can be under-theorized, but if we're mindful, does that make us more conscious, and does that make our introspection perhaps more accurate when it's necessarily a bit imprecise? I'm going to start with you, Louise. You can answer both or one or whichever you prefer.
I'll just speak to the relationship between language and consciousness. Of course, we can't study consciousness without language because language is our tool for doing all sorts of study. But I think there's every reason to think that consciousness can be dissociated from language. Pre-linguistic humans, babies we call them, are clearly conscious. I could go through some infant studies that I find just fascinating if you force me to. But babies have consciousness without language, and animals do. Descartes, who I'm sure never had a dog, thought that animals had no consciousness because they couldn't speak. I think that's just bias and flies in the face of all the functional evidence, which is that dogs feel pain, that dogs experience something like emotions, that dogs reason. Lots of good evidence for that.
Philip.
Pick up on the question of whether consciousness is vague. There are a lot of actually interesting philosophical discussions about this. A very interesting recent paper by Eric Schwitzgebel arguing that consciousness is vague and that there might be, for example, no fact of the matter as to whether a garden snail has an inner life or not. So we're curious, does it have an inner life or is it just a mechanism? He thinks there might be no fact of the matter, just as like some people, there's no fact of the matter as to whether they're tall or not tall. It's a borderline case. It might be the same with snails. I myself don't think that makes sense. I don't think we can make coherent sense of consciousness being vague in that sense. My intuitions are there in line with the defenders of the integrated information theory. And I've actually argued this leads to a nice argument for panpsychism, which I won't go into now. But just finally, even if consciousness is vague, I don't think that would allow us to circumnavigate the mind-body problem. I think that we'd still have to confront those issues.
Maja.
Hi. First, to your interesting question about non-linguistic creatures. Yeah, I think that is it is a big area in the science of consciousness to figure out how to study them, and the kind of measure that I didn't want to speak about, but the kind of consciousness meter glimpse that we're getting, there are ways to start studying linguistic conscious creatures who then, well, we can learn about their brains and then maybe use that to study non-linguistic creatures. So I think that is an interesting question and a challenge for the field.
It could just be a sign. It's a sign, a baby smiling.
Yeah, so presumably you'd learn about those signs first by realizing that they are indicative of consciousness, and by also combining it with verbal or at least report-based access to consciousness. But where there? If perceptual conditions are bad, we're not so good at perceiving either, right? If the light is bad. So if we're not, the best situation to introspect is when things are brimming and the case is clear. And yes, there's going to be kind of less or more fuzzy states of consciousness that are therefore harder to introspect. I don't think that that's a real problem for using introspection to get data, because you want to just do it in good conditions, and that's partly what the challenge is, the methodological challenge, to figure out the good conditions. But you did ask about whether mindfulness might improve, so meditation-based, for example. There's, again, a huge research body to look at whether meditators are better at introspecting. Now, from my vantage point, I look at that as also from a methodological point. It's like, how are these studies done? How are we getting data that the introspection is better, perhaps, when people are doing meditation? So I have all sorts of maybe niggly things to say about how these studies are done, but it is a very interesting question, and there's some people who really think that practicing mindfulness or meditation does make you a better introspector. There's all sorts of other training you might go in for, and the old introspectionists in the 19th century and early 20th century did think that training was important. They didn't go in for meditation, but what they thought is the training is important that you keep the different types of introspection apart, that you don't let, when you're retrospecting, let it collapse into using attention at the time of stimulus presentation, for example. And that's the kind of thing where I think not enough is done in today's experiments to keep these things properly apart. Interesting question, thank you.
Yeah, just keep it very short, because I agree that language is necessary to study consciousness, but not necessary for consciousness. And one of the things that we see in the sort of neuroscience of consciousness is a lot of things that people now know about, let's say, visual, the neural mechanisms underlying visual awareness, visual consciousness, are known through the study of non-linguistic creatures, non-human primates and rodents. So we already kind of assume that these creatures are conscious, and therefore their data is relevant for understanding human consciousness. On introspection, I think this is a really interesting question, and the mindfulness tradition, one way of thinking about it, at least certain ways of engaging with mindfulness, are all about training attention. And you learn to pay attention through meditation. And so I think there's a good a priori reason to think that it might be good for introspection, in the sense that you realize, what I'm feeling is actually a sensation in my body. It's not just a worry about the future. Of course, the worry there is you're actually changing what you're measuring at the same time. So somebody who's meditated, then they're having a different experience. They may be differently able to access it, but it's nonetheless a different experience. And just to say, I totally agree with the need to do introspection better. And there's so much that the early psychologists did that was really cool before people came along with brain scanners and messed everything up, because suddenly you could just put people in that and get a nice picture. And in our work, we definitely separate the kind of contemporaneous phenomenological report from retrospective, and that's key if you're going to make inferences about introspective data.
Edward, in a rather unorthodox move, am I allowed to ask you to explain that rather wonderful piece of experimentation on introspection that you sent to me? You might have to come up to where there's a microphone.
Speaking loudly is no good? All right. Yeah, I can't remember the name of the scientist now, but there was a very, very dedicated physiologist in the 1950s or 60s who was puzzling. Actually, his puzzle was not directly the puzzle about what's the relationship between physiology and consciousness. He was worried about which anatomical structures in the knee cause pain in your knee. So he was so obsessed with solving this problem that he got a friend of his to open up his knee without anesthetic. And he said, okay, now tweak this cartilage. And he said, nothing at all. And then he said, all right, tweak that. And I'm sorry, my physiology is poor. I can't remember what was tweaked after that. And he felt, as he described it, exquisite pain. And so he established that actually, cartilage damage is not responsible for the particular kind of knee pain that he was suffering from. But this is often used as an example of how, well, hang on a minute, the reason we have this problem with introspection is just that you haven't got the same guy doing the physiology and doing the introspection. If we were all as brave as Doctor, I'm afraid I've forgotten his name, you'd be able to tweak the right bits and then perform the correlation directly.
Yes, don't try this at home. And Anil, I hope you're not going to try that in the lab.
It's good, but there are sort of modern day, less kind of bizarrely strange methods of doing that. But I mean, I think that the idea is here: can you kind of go the other way around? Can you intervene in the mechanism and see what the sort of experiential consequence is, and do that systematically, right? So you tweak this cartilage, you tweak that cartilage. Maybe you'll say, let's activate these neurons or those neurons, or that would be the equivalent. And of course, there are methods by which this can be done. They're difficult to do in humans for the reason that you've beautifully illustrated. So definitely don't open up your heads at home and start putting an electric screwdriver in. But we have things that are roughly equivalent. We can't. So there's really interesting studies that use a method called transcranial magnetic stimulation. This was part of this PCI thing I mentioned earlier. It's basically a magnet that injects a very short, sharp pulse of energy into the brain. And you don't feel this. You don't feel the pulse itself, but depending on the timing of it and the location of it, it can have an effect on your experience. So if you do it over visual cortex, in some conditions, you'll see a flash of light, and in other conditions, you won't. And so you can tweak the cartilage in the brain, and I don't think it solves the problems of introspection, but it gives a very important additional tool, because intervening and seeing what happens is always more powerful than passive observation of what happens when you do something purely externally. And in animals, of course, you can do this with much greater precision, and a lot of the cutting edge now in neuroscience of consciousness is done in humans who have indeed electrodes implanted into their brains. This is usually because they have epilepsy. Epilepsy sometimes needs surgery, and in neurology clinics, typically before an epilepsy surgery, but quite often, you will implant electrodes in this person's brain, so you know exactly which part of the brain is responsible for the seizures. But then these people have electrodes in their brains and are basically fine, and so you can go and do experiments with them if they agree. But you can record from single neurons or groups of neurons, and you can stimulate. So you can get in there, not with the coverage that we would need, not with anything like the resolution we would hope for, but the principle is established, and it's a very powerful principle.
Louise.
I just want to put in a plug for top-down analysis first. You don't want to figure out what's wrong with your computer by going around with a magnet and touching different parts of it, right? You don't want to just muck around with stuff and see what happens. Now, that's not what Anil's describing, though it does sound like what this hapless doctor was doing. You can't not necessarily infer function from seeing that if you touch a certain part of the brain, something starts happening or something stops happening. You really need the functional analysis to know exactly what that part is contributing. If you're getting hold of a structure that is implicated in a lot of functions, then you can see that there's a degradation of performance in one function, and perhaps infer incorrectly that that's all that structure does. So don't try to diagnose your computer problems or see what's wrong with your colored television by going in and sticking screwdrivers in random places and see what happens.
Definitely don't do that. Do we have some more questions? Yes, lots of questions. Do you want to come up to the microphone? Just make your way over, and we'll take 2 or 3, and if you're happy to keep going, we can keep going till 15:15. So we'll have to be brief, I think, in this round. That was a rather lovely conversation, though. Oh, loads of questions. Oh, you were all shy before. Honestly, what did you think we were going to do? Eat you? All right. So, do you want to go? Because I don't want to keep everyone too long.
Okay. Regarding what we know, like from consciousness and what I've gathered in this like little seminar, and that there's so much more to be learned. Given there's still a lot that we're puzzled by. How does the unconscious then fit in? Given it's right, like you're not aware of it, but it's another part of the brain that's vitally important. And like I have a bit of psychology background, so from what I know, Freud was like very big on it, saying it's driven our it drives your behaviors, your desires, and everything. However, it's a hard thing because it's like something that's very, I would say, very untestable. Because like how it's the unconscious.
Lovely. Next one. We'll take 3, and then we'll see how we do.
Hello. So my question's just for Louise. Sorry, but it sounds like you think there are levels of explanation, and that we should look in a particular explanation. And once we've exhausted that level, we should move to the next level. So if we exhaust all the possible levels of explanation, so we look at the top level, go down, 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 down. What happens when we exhaust all our levels and never find our complete explanation of consciousness, which seems to be what people like Philip want to look for?
Okay, lovely.
I seem to be confused with the problem at hand, because if we look at the perspective from the materialist view, then I would assume that there is no kind of, panpsychism would assume that there's a consciousness that creates the reality. Materialism would deny that. And so, from a materialist point of view, how would you even think that consciousness exists? And from the panpsychism, if you adhere to the panpsychism, then I'd assume that most spiritualists would say that scientists would be quite limited to explore that, because it seems like we're trying to observe or measure or something that is outside of our perspective. And it just seems to me that if you adhere to panpsychism, then there's any type of discussion of scientists trying to solve this problem is just doomed to fail.
Okay, lovely. Let's go with those. If you can keep it brief, and I'll try and get a few more of you in before we have to pack up. So, Louise, do you want to answer that question very specifically to you? There are these levels of explanation. If we exhaust all the levels, what happens when we don't find an answer?
Well, I said I think that human science can solve the problem of consciousness, but I could be wrong. There are lots of things. I mean, the physicists, I don't think, have reconciled gravity and quantum mechanics yet, but we're still working on it. I mean, there's always a risk that we won't get answers that we want. What I was going to say, when you said, what if we get all the way to the bottom, I thought, well, what happens then as we go for drinks? But, yeah, so it's an empirical issue.
And Philip, I think you're being kicked off the stage. I mean, should you even be in this conversation if we're talking to Anil the materialist?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we need to distinguish the scientific questions and the philosophical questions to this problem of, how we could explore panpsychism. I think the scientific questions would more or less go the same, whatever your position on these philosophical views are. And then we have to face the philosophical questions, which cannot be in any straightforward way addressed by an experiment. You might ask, well, how the hell do we do it? Well, I try to gesture at the case for panpsychism. I think one of the 3 views is incoherent, and one is more parsimonious than the other, so that's the one we go for.
And Maja, I don't know, I'm going to give you the pick of the lot, but there's also, how does unconsciousness fit into this conversation we're having?
Let me say something about that then. Although I'm totally unqualified.
You don't have to answer. I'm not going to make...
No, it's just that so Freudian psychology is one approach, one theory about the mind, and I think sort of not everybody might be persuaded by it. So you don't have to fit it in. That's the first point. You might think, well, there are no such things like the Freudian unconscious states. Now, are there unconscious states in the mind? For sure, right? But, scientists and philosophers theorize a lot about them. One is, I hope most of us believe that the Earth is round. right? But you didn't think about it before I just said it, but you had the belief nonetheless, right? And there was an unconscious state that you were in, and we theorize about that. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Anil, briefly.
Yeah, just to add a little bit there, I think it's difficult to fit in the sort of Freudian unconscious to modern neuroscience. So people are trying. There are now fields of neuropsychoanalysis and so on. But there are, so instead of thinking of another unconscious mind that's sort of parallel coexisting with a conscious mind, I think that some things that the brain does become reflected in our conscious awareness and other things don't. And that's a very empirically well-established distinction, and figuring out the limits of what the brain can do or what the organism can do in virtue of unconscious processing is a really exciting research area. You know, what can we do? We can't invent things necessarily, but we can still detect information. Can we add up unconsciously? People disagree about that. There's interesting stuff there, and I can't remember what the other ones were now.
We'll leave it at that. Marvellous. Now, listen, we are well over time. Are you all happy to stay here for another 5 minutes? If I was on the radio, I'd have been kicked off air by now. So I'm very conscious of time. All right, so what are we going to do? There's so many of you. I feel really mean. Okay, I'm just going to take all the questions. You've got to be really quick, and then I'm going to leave it to these guys to decide what they want to answer.
To each of the panelists regarding the teleportation problem.
One of the easy ones.
Yeah. Would you enter the machine to skip a 23-hour flight, or would you fear the death of your personal conscious experience? I'm asking this to challenge something a materialist might claim, that only the specific composition of material properties are essential for a specific version of consciousness.
Lovely. Thank you.
A question for Phil, really. Okay, because you're a strong proponent of panpsychism. What do you think it's made of? Particles, fields, and how are we going to measure it?
Lovely. Thank you for being brief.
Hi, I think it was Philip that said consciousness and the physical world are very equally fundamental but distinct. I was just wondering, kind of, without any kind of social conditioning or conscious empirical experience, I want to use a hypothetical that someone is born into a room and they don't leave that room for 15, 16 years. What are your opinions about how the conscious would operate in moral situations or moral decision-making without any exposure to kind of the natural world or any social conditioning at all, and how kind of they would make moral decision-makings without that experience in the first place, and how the conscious would work?
Okay.
Thank you. I have a question for Louise, or other people can weigh in as well. So you said we have to go top down. I was wondering if we have to go to the quantum level, because at the quantum level things are completely different. I was wondering if you have any thought on that. And for the rest, does like quantum physics or quantum knowledge? I mean, our knowledge about quantum physics will have any shed any light on this conscious study and the field? Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you.
Hello. So you mentioned experiential properties and physical properties and correlations. So I was wondering, do you think that the correlation between these two kinds of properties is metaphysically necessary or contingent? And is this question significant for your work or not? Thank you.
Hello. So if what we're trying to do here is attempt to actually understand consciousness, I think we have to look at both the hows and the whys. And my problem that emerges here is that the defense of science here only looks at the hows and overlooks the whys. They sort of hyper-focus on experiments, scientific experiments. So don't you think that it is a philosophical question, because even the experiments sort of tend to lead us towards a philosophical conclusion? For example, how it's been proven that thoughts emerge in the subconscious and then they move into the conscious, and that backs up theories such as hard determinism and multiple examples such as that. So what is your response to that?
You briefly discussed entities which we would say might be conscious, but which don't express themselves verbally, like animals and babies in certain cases. What about entities which can express themselves verbally, which we wouldn't say are conscious? So you invited a neuroscientist. What about inviting a computer scientist, in a sense? What about artificial intelligences, software, those types of questions.
Lovely. Okay, Anil, I'm going to start with you, and if we can keep it fairly brief. I know
Okay,
there's a
I'll
lot
keep it
there.
very brief. I'll go. So, teleportation machine, where you put yourself in a thing and you get physically regenerated somewhere else. Would I do it? Absolutely not. Crazy.
We totally agree.
I have certain confidence in science, but not that. No. Panpsychism, I'll leave to him. Moral decision making when you've been isolated. This is really interesting. I think it's kind of an empirical problem because clearly we're born with certain things that we've inherited. We don't have to develop everything de novo. So are we born with moral instinct? I think this is a really interesting empirical question. Don't know the answer to it. Quantum level, do we need to go all the way down to the quantum level? Here, there's a terrible history of quantum physics and consciousness, people getting totally confused, with Roger Penrose kicking this off a while ago and then other people joining in. Just because quantum mechanics is mysterious and consciousness seems mysterious does not mean they're related. They might not be related at all. They might be, but there's the best person who's spoken about this, Carlo Rovelli, who you will know, who talks about relational quantum mechanics, which is kind of interesting because it just shows the resources of materialism are greater than we might think. There is very little evidence that quantum mechanics does anything of note in the brain. It's useful for things like magnetic sensation, photosynthesis, but does it do anything in the brain? It's too warm and wet in there. It doesn't. Neural correlates of consciousness. They're a critical method in the empirical science of consciousness. Very illuminating, very interesting. Are they necessary? Well, that would be much more interesting if they're merely contingent. But I think we have to go from mere correlation towards explanation. That's when it becomes interesting. And that, of course, is part of functional analysis too, which gets onto this how versus why. And I do think scientists ask the why question as well as the how. This is part of functional analysis. A good scientific account of something not only explains how it works, but why it works the way it does. What is it for? Theodore Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, which is all about function. That's true of consciousness as much as anything else. To AI, this is really, really interesting question, very timely, because we are now indeed faced with systems that can speak to us, and yet they're just complicated pattern recognition statistical algorithms. You might remember the Google engineer Blake Lemoine, who helped develop this language model, large language model called Lambda, and said it was sentient and got fired. If there's one thing that united the AI community, it was thinking that he was nuts. There is no good reason to think that AI is conscious, and the ability to speak is not determinate of being sentient. But it does raise a really interesting problem that I'd like to leave in your mind, which is that a lot of the debate in AI has been, would we get a conscious machine? How do we build a conscious machine? We shouldn't even been trying. It'd be an ethical disaster. You don't do something just because it's cool. It's very stupid. However, we may well be faced with situations where we interact with systems that we cannot help but perceive them as being conscious in the same way that Louise was describing with the Muller-Lyer illusion. There may be a cognitive impenetrability to certain systems that just persuade us that they're conscious, even though we know that they're not, or have no good reason to believe that they are. And that's going to be incredibly disruptive to society. And this is a theme that's much better dealt with in science fiction than either in science or in philosophy, I think, so far.
Terrifying thought. Maja, as many or as few as you'd like.
I definitely want to answer the beamer question, because the teletransportation, because I think a lot about that. And it depends whether you're pulverized and sent through bit by bit and built up again from your own parts, or whether you're just destroyed and a replica of you is being built I watched Star Trek, in the other place. So the second one, absolutely not. The first one, maybe. And there it depends really, and that morphs into the hows and whys question. That's where the science will give us some answers, whether that's a good idea to get into that machine or not, right? It depends now on what consciousness is, in that sense where we don't have to answer the philosophical or engage in the philosophical project that Philip is engaged in, but where I think that's not the only philosophical question. I don't want people to think that that's what philosophy is. It's excellent and it may float your boat, but there's so much philosophy to do on the scientific side. And, science might give you an answer whether it's a good idea to step into that machine if they can just rebuild you from your own parts. That's
Philip, my stomach's rumbling, so keep it brief.
I agree with Maja that the mind-body problem isn't the only philosophical thing to do here. Guy asked me about particles or fields. I would tend to think the fundamental forms of consciousness are had by fields rather than particles, both because theoretical physicists tend to think fields are fundamental. Also, I think it leads to a more attractive form of panpsychism, as I defended in my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. Metaphysically necessary. So the panpsychist view is that the interactions between the fundamental conscious entities form certain patterns, certain mathematical structures, and those patterns and mathematical structures just are what we call physics. So this was Russell's insight, that we can get physics out of more fundamental facts about mind or consciousness. Because physics is purely mathematical, as long as we have the right mathematical structures, we can get physics out of that. And so that's why panpsychists have essentially solved the hard problem. And teleportation, I'm kind of agnostic on personal identity, but I don't think, probably not just in case.
Louise.
So I want to say a couple of things that I think bear on a number of the questions. First of all, I think of consciousness as a functional property of a material being. So I think consciousness has to be embodied. I don't think consciousness is a program. I don't agree with Dave Chalmers about virtual worlds being real worlds. I think those are abstract representations of a structure that could be embodied. And I totally agree with Anil, what do we say? Anil.
I can't pronounce it properly either, as we discussed earlier.
I would not, under any circumstances, teleport if it involved the destruction of my body and a recreation of a body. If they could do one, they can do two. And if they do two, they can't both be me, so neither of them is me. I agree with Maya's point that it might make a difference if you could actually take the parts of us and put them together. I mean, we have different intuitions about identity. Watches we can take apart and put back together. We think it's still the same watch. I don't know about animals. Animals die when you do that, so maybe what you would be making would be another person just like you out of parts that were yours, but isn't you. Anyway, I would not, even if I trusted the technology to do exactly what they said it was going to do, I wouldn't think that that was me. I also wanted to say that I don't think that consciousness, though it requires embodiment, it doesn't require any particular material medium. It could be, it's wetware in our case, but there could be things made out of metal and circuitry that have consciousness if they have the right functional organization, which would have to be very complex. It has to be more than being able to recognize patterns. It has to be able to do more than predict common finishings of sentences and so forth. It has to be integrated, in particular, it has to be integrated with perception. It has to have the being would have to have the ability to form cognitive states that can be integrated with information about the passing scene that's coming in. That's not the only functional requirement, but that would have to be. And again, could an AI be conscious? Well, it depends on the architecture. If it's a connectionist architecture, if it's just a pattern recognizer, then no. But if it embodied the program that our minds run on, I don't see why not.
Well, what an amazing conversation. Thank you all very much. I don't think I've ever overrun quite so badly. I would be sacked. The book at bedtime has finished, and we've gone into the evening comedy programme. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for some great questions. Thank you to our panel, to Anil Seth, Maja Spener, Philip Goff, and Louise Antony. And thank you to the Royal Institute of Philosophy and to Edward Harcourt. And I hope to see you all again next time. Thank you very much.